Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Dr. Mac's Disaster Hack. I'm so glad you've joined me. As you can see, we're going to do something a little bit different today. This presentation will be a little bit longer than normal, but hopefully we'll learn a little bit along the way and have some fun. Here we go. So my objective today is to help us to understand the importance of the twin pillars of emergency management according to Ronald Perry, the need for preparedness and improvisation. So we're going to look at those and how they can be applied in emergency management. So my overall message today is fairly straightforward. Preparedness and planning is organizing before an event, but in a disaster situation we might have to improvise based on the unique aspects of the hazards and the vulnerability involved. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. And what I would suggest to you is that even when we're improvising, we're also planning and preparing at the same time. And then finally, emergency management requires creative problem solving. So let's look at those topics today. Well, let me provide a little bit of context about this presentation. I was a pretty rambunctious kid when I was growing up. I had a big will like this and would go blazing down the avenues, and I'm surprised I didn't kill myself. And I'm surprised I didn't kill my friends as well, because unlike this young man on the right, I would line my friends up and I would jump over them on my big will. But as I grew up, I became more interested in sports and wanted to be a professional football player. I really liked football, I admired my heroes, and I wanted to be just like them. The other thing I did was ski, and I would be a little bit crazy, as you can see on this picture on the left. And unfortunately, I crashed one time and busted up my knee and had to have surgery. So my knee healed, and I continued to play football. And one day in practice in high school, I was hit and tackled, and unfortunately that blew out my knee again. So I tore my meniscus, my MCL, my ACL, and that was basically the end of my football career. Well, because I couldn't play football anymore, I had to turn my attention to other activities. And one of the things I really liked was music. In the 80s, there was some great music, big bands with big hair, and some great tunes. So I decided to purchase a guitar and an amp and learn some of the music of that era. And here's some examples if you're interested. Well, I've bored you enough with that. But anyway, I picked up music and I had a lot of fun. So my friends and I started a band, and we played in our homes, in the basement. We maybe have never really gotten out of our basement phase, but our parents loved our music. In fact, my dad would come to us and say, "Hey, Dave, we really love your music. It's great. We feel so selfish that your band is always practicing here. Why don't you let Sean's parents hear your music as well?" And so we rotated basements among my friends' families. But we did have a couple of performances, and here's one that you can see. And so we enjoyed playing when we could in front of people. So because I couldn't play football, I turned my attention to music. But unfortunately, that didn't really work out that well either. You have this expectation that you'll become popular as a musician, and that just wasn't the reality. My reality was that I had some guitars and some equipment and gear, but unfortunately I didn't even have a cat, as this picture demonstrates. Therefore, I decided that I needed to grow up. As part of that process, I wanted to get married, and so, believe it or not, I sold all of my equipment and purchased a ring and proposed to my wife, and fortunately she said yes. Of course, I had to support her and my kids, and therefore decided that if I can't play football professionally, if I can't be a musician, then maybe I'll have to settle for being a professor, and so that's what I did. I pursued my education. Well, I've been really blessed and really fortunate. I've had a great life, but I think COVID caused a lot of us to do some reflection, and during that period, I started to look at guitars. And here was my wife's response. Of course, she's been a trooper, and she did allow me to purchase some equipment. And fortunately, I'm in a better position to purchase some nice equipment and gear, as you can see here. And that long, drawn-out context brings me back to Eddie Van Halen, my favorite rock star of the 1980s. Let me share a little bit about the history of Eddie Van Halen. His parents immigrated to the United States after World War II, and they settled in Southern California. Eddie's father was a jazz musician, and music was very important to this family. And so starting at age 6, Eddie Van Halen took classical piano lessons. Later on, Eddie became interested in the rock music of his era, and he purchased a drum set. The story is that when he was out delivering newspapers to pay for his drums, his brother was practicing, and he soon realized that Alex was much better than he was on the drums. And so Eddie took up guitar. He admired Eric Clapton, and he taught himself that instrument. Eddie and his brother started a band named the Broken Combs. They played at their elementary school, and this experience really instilled in him a desire to play professionally. And therefore, he always had a guitar in his hands. He was always practicing nonstop. This dedication and work ethic was carried out throughout Van Halen's life. So he had meticulous recording sessions with a lot of editing, a lot of rigorous rehearsals before concerts, a lot of sound checks. Everything was done to be ready for performances. So he was prepared and he planned. One of the interesting stories about Van Halen as a band relates to their contracts with the venues where they performed. There would be hundreds of check items that had to occur to make sure the concert would go off without a hitch. And one of the things that Van Halen did in the contract was specify that in their break room, they would have to have 2 containers of M&Ms, one with all of the brown M&Ms separated, and one with all of the other colored M&Ms there as well. And according to the band, if this occurred, they knew that everything else in the contract was fulfilled. And so that was another example of their planning and preparedness for their concerts. Okay, well, what does this have to do with emergency management? Let me transition a little bit and talk about preparedness and planning in emergency management. As you know, planning is an essential element of community preparedness. It's vital and indispensable, and we've all heard the famous quote, "If you fail to plan, you plan to fail." Planning is one element, of course, of overall preparedness, and preparedness is basically getting ready before a disaster event, and it identifies how organizations will respond to uncertainties. And plans and preparedness help us to develop strategies and procedures to cover a wide variety of hazards and disaster events. The literature on preparedness and planning is full of principles to help emergency management. Preparedness and planning must be comprehensive, looking at all hazards, all phases, all of the actors involved. It must be based on actual behavior, not myths. Planning must assign responsibility for the functions among the different parties and stakeholders involved. And a major goal of preparedness is to facilitate coordination. One of the important principles is to avoid the paper plan syndrome, meaning that we can't just write a plan, we have to develop capabilities to implement the plan. And of course, and lastly, our plans need to be updated frequently, perhaps each year. Even though preparedness and planning are extremely important in emergency management, we still don't know enough about these concepts and these activities. Our planning may be inadequate or it's mistaken based on false assumptions. In addition, we have to realize, as Quarantelli has noted, that planning is different than managing. Disasters may make plans irrelevant, and therefore we may need to improvise and be creative in disasters. Improvisation is essential in disasters and in emergency management, and it's also important in other aspects of our life. Coming back to Van Halen, the band had a performance in 2015 on Jimmy Kimmel Live, and singer David Lee Roth cut his nose with a baton. He's kind of a crazy front man and always twirling a baton and jumping around, and he smacked himself in the nose, and this required some medical treatment. So while he was getting treated, Eddie and his brother started to improvise to kill time. And this situation required that they would depart from their planned concert set and just goof around for a little bit to kill time until David Lee Roth could come back and join the band. As I mentioned, improvisation is also really important in emergency management, and there's been some great research on this topic. My colleague Jim Kendra from the University of Delaware has written on this extensively, looking at 9/11 and the waterborne evacuation. If you haven't looked at his research, I would encourage you to examine that. When disasters occur, and when things are uncertain, and when the circumstances require us to depart from plans, which they often do, we must improvise. And so we have to organize in real time and develop new management procedures. And in fact, improvisation is so common in disasters that Kathleen Tierney has said that if an event doesn't require improvisation, it's probably not a disaster. This brings up the question, what is improvisation? Well, it's a combination of our intuition, it's related to creativity, it's adapting to unique circumstances. It's really unscripted activities that we haven't anticipated before. It's improvised behaviors, and that also requires emergent organizational structures in disasters. Like planning and preparedness, there's also some key principles of improvisation. First of all, it's impossible to plan for everything, and in fact, relying on plans can be detrimental. And so we have to be flexible with the unfolding needs that disasters present to us. Like preparedness and planning, there's also some limitations of improvisation. Our improvisations may be divorced from prior plans. Maybe we misunderstand the environment of a disaster. Our intuition could be incorrect. And maybe we're not vetting our decisions sufficiently as we improvise. At this time, I'd like to depart for just a moment and provide a quick side note. Obviously, we need to prepare and plan in emergency management, but as I've mentioned, we need to improvise. But interestingly, we need to prepare and plan even during our improvisations in response and recovery. And let me talk about that for just a minute. The literature on these topics really says that we will do one of two things. We'll either rely on our existing plans or we'll improvise. But others admit that planning will occur during a disaster, and that's a very important feature, I would argue. In certain cases, our pre-planned operations, our plans, may not work, and so we have to develop and deploy new procedures in real time. And this is what makes decision-making very complex in disasters. In other words, we have to make sense of the unfolding disaster. And this is really complicated because we have limited time and there's dynamic conditions. and there's pressure to act in an urgent manner. Perhaps for this reason, planning is a very important element of the incident command system. Again, we often think of planning as occurring before a disaster, but with ICS, we realize we need to plan during a disaster as well. I've written a little bit about this topic. I call it spontaneous planning, and if you're interested, I've provided the citation here. Let me provide an example of planning, of improvisation, and spontaneous planning to bring it to life. In football, a game plan is developed prior to the game, and that is practiced and rehearsed, if you will, during the week so that the football teams are ready on Saturday or Sunday to play against their opponent. Even though the plays are scripted, sometimes they just won't work out. Perhaps there's more pressure on the quarterback. He has to roll out. That throws off the timing of a play, and therefore the players have to improvise, as you can see with this picture of people breaking off their routes and trying to get open so the quarterback can complete a pass. Thus, there's a game plan that's developed. There's preparedness going on. There's also improvising in the game. And then there's what I would suggest is spontaneous planning. And what I mean by this is that the coaches are actually reacting to what the defense is doing, and they're calling new plays. The players themselves are talking about what's going on and coordinating and deciding how they will react to certain circumstances. There's audibles at the line of scrimmage, and the coaches near the press box are relaying information down to the coaches and the players so that they can adapt to the unfolding situation of the game. Such spontaneous planning activities take place in emergency management. In fact, whether it's in the planning section of ICS or an emergency operations center, there's a lot of what I would term spontaneous planning going on to react more effectively to the disaster as it unfolds and as new information is acquired and as organizations try to deal with the challenges that they face. This type of spontaneous planning requires a lot of creativity, and so I want to shift gears and now talk about the creativity and perhaps give some examples coming back to Eddie Van Halen. So Eddie Van Halen was really creative with his gear and his music, and let me share some examples here. So first of all, he was very disappointed with the feedback from his pickup that would make some annoying sounds with his amps. And so he decided to dip them in wax. This is called potting, and it eliminates unwanted noise. And this process is actually used by many guitar manufacturers today. Here's a second example of creativity. When Eddie Van Halen started to perform, he played in smaller venues because the band was just getting established. And so he noticed that his amp was too loud. It would just blast the people in the audience. And so one of the things he did is he turned his amp around, turned it backwards, so that would minimize or dampen some of the noise or the sound to make it more bearable. But he had a problem. He wanted his amp to scream so that he could perform the way he does or did. But it was too loud. And so he explained this problem to a clerk at Dial Radio. It's like a Radio Shack store. And the man recommended that he use what's known as a variac. And this allowed him to keep all the dials up on his amp so his guitar would scream, but by lowering the power, he would lower the sound or the volume of his amp. And so there's another example of his creativity. A third example of his creativity relates to his issues or concerns about tuning stability. Eddie Van Halen's performance or the way he played was very dynamic, and it would cause his guitars to go out of tune. So he explained this to a colleague of his, a guy named Floyd Rose, and they came up with what's known as a double locking tremolo system. And this enhances or helps you to maintain tuning stability when you're performing. Eddie's creativity extended to other aspects of his guitars. He realized as he was playing that no guitar had all of the features that he wanted. And so what he did is he actually assembled parts from various guitars into what's known as a Frankenstrat, if you will. And this allowed him to get the versatility and tone that he wanted. Let me share a little bit more about that. The first guitar that was ever invented was the Telecaster. There's some advantages of this guitar. It has a thin, fast neck, and it could give you a deep sound. But in Eddie's opinion, it was heavy, it was uncomfortable, had a little bit too much country twang, didn't have a tremolo bar, and it wasn't very stable in terms of tuning. Eddie tried the Les Paul, the Gibson Les Paul. There's some benefits of this guitar. It has a great pickup and a full sound, but there were some drawbacks. It's a little bit slower to play, has a very wide neck, it's relatively heavy, somewhat uncomfortable, doesn't have a tremolo bar as well, and it lacks tuning stability. Eddie tried the Stratocaster, and he liked this in many ways. It had a faster neck, it was light, it was comfortable, it had a tremolo bar, but unfortunately it sounded a little bit thin. The pickup configuration would kind of mess with Eddie's playing a little bit, and it lacked tuning stability. Therefore, Eddie invented the Frankenstrat. He again combined parts from various different types of guitars, the pickup from the Gibson, the main body from a Stratocaster, and then he added some of the other features with the double locking tremolo system. And this was relatively light, it was comfortable, he could play it very quickly, didn't have middle pickup, had a full sound, and had the tuning stability that he desired. Eddie therefore invented a new type of guitar, the Super Shredder. Eddie's creativity extended to other aspects of his guitar. One of the things that he liked to do is to drop the E string down to D. In order to do this, you would have to basically, take out some tools and loosen some things and then tighten your strings back up. This was complicated and problematic and time-consuming, and so he worked with engineers to develop the drop D tuna device, and now this is common on many rock guitars. Eddie was clearly creative with his equipment, but he's most well known for his music. It was extraordinary. Let me provide some examples and share that with you. So this is my best effort to imitate some Van Halen. Here we go. Well, I've probably bored you enough with those examples, but you get the sense of how creative he was in his music. Let me mention a few other things about his creativity. A lot of guitarists would simply plug their guitar into their amp and play and not use a lot of effects. That was not Van Halen. He was always chasing tone, if you will. His 90s tone, for example, was very well known. And in this particular era, he would play with several amps. Some of them would have the guitar tuned down lower and with a certain delay on it. Then he would have some amps that had a dry setting, no effects. And then he would have other amps that were tuned up with a longer delay. And so he would get this really wide sound in his music, and he's very well known for that. Some people might not be aware of this, but Eddie Van Halen was also very creative on the keyboard. He played piano and synthesizer, and let me share some of his examples here. In one case, he's using a electric piano, running it through a guitar effect pedal into an amp. In other cases, he's playing jazz music and his dad is playing clarinet. There's some other examples where there's a cappella singing going on at the end of a concert that they performed. There's another case where he's using an electric drill on his guitar. I'll play some of these. Again, bear with me. There's probably a couple of minutes of some examples here. So let me go through these. Anyway, again, I've probably bored you to death, but there's some other examples of his unique music and musical talents. So we might ask ourselves, what does all of this have to do with emergency management and disasters? Well, we can learn a lot from Eddie Van Halen, I would argue. His experience in music, his preparedness, his planning allowed him to improvise when needed. His knowledge and creativity permitted him to try new things. He was willing to take risks, and he sought assistance from others when needed. and I would argue some of these lessons can be applied to emergency management. Let's look at a few examples where these principles can be applied to the important profession of emergency management. First of all, emergency managers can rely on their prior experience. This will help them improvise and respond to disasters. A real-world example is 9/11. Of course, when the World Trade Center towers came down, the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, was located in building number 7. That was destroyed as well due to fire. And emergency managers in New York were responding to the world's most significant terrorist attack with no functioning EOC. And so what they did is they established a new EOC at Pier 92. They had reserved this pier for some exercises they were going to be conducting. They decided to basically set up a new EOC, and it looked exactly like the prior EOC. So in this case, they used their prior experience, the prior layout of their EOC, to create or recreate a new EOC to respond to this disaster. Another example relates to our knowledge and ability to be creative in disaster situations. I've already mentioned a little bit about 9/11 and the waterborne evacuation, but let me talk about it and draw it out a little bit further. So when the 9/11 terrorist attacks occurred, leaders were concerned that there would be additional attacks on transportation systems in New York, and so they decided to shut everything down. So the subway was shut down, trains were shut down, and bridges were shut down. Unfortunately, people still had to get off Manhattan, the island, and one of the only ways to do that was by waterborne transportation. So this was something that was never planned in emergency management. It didn't exist in the emergency operations plan, and yet they improvised this response and safely moved between 300 and 500,000 people, the most in history, to bring them to safety and get them away from the dangers of ground zero. A third example relates to being willing to take risks. And a good case in point is the Apollo 13 explosion that damaged the spacecraft. As you know from the story or the movie, the lunar module became a lifeboat, but the astronauts encountered a problem because they were basically losing enough oxygen for all 3 astronauts in this particular case. And so they had to work with engineers on the ground to basically fix the oxygen scrubber to make sure that they would be able to survive, and that's what they did. All of this was a risk, but it was a risk that they took, and fortunately it paid off. So a final example relates to seeking assistance from others, and the Oklahoma City bombing is an example I think that is worth mentioning here. In this particular case, 168 people were killed, many were injured. The victims and their families required a lot of assistance, and so the emergency managers established a resource coordination committee, and this was established to address immediate and long-term needs. And so when required, you can get help from others to help you improvise and react to unique disaster circumstances. With all of this in mind, I think we can learn a lot from Eddie Van Halen. His experience in music, his dedication, his preparedness and planning allowed him to be able to improvise when needed. His knowledge and creativity allowed him to try new things, and he was willing to take risks. And as needed, he sought assistance from others, whether that was in terms of the Variac or his double locking tremolo system or the drop D tuna device. Consequently, I think a lot of these lessons can be applied to emergency management. In essence, disasters will require serious preparedness and planning efforts. Disasters will also require improvisation when needed, and our experience and preparedness will make us more efficient and flexible when we respond and recover. Our knowledge and creativity can allow us to try unique things to respond and react to different, unusual circumstances. We may need to take risks when necessary, and of course, we need to seek assistance from others and that will help us to improvise. Well, let me wrap this up by sharing a few implications, and they are as follows. First of all, consider spontaneous planning, the importance of improvising in disasters, and recognize that improvisation may or may not be possible. Sometimes, of course, we're bound with laws and policies and regulations. For instance, we're not really going to be able to improvise disaster assistance programs by the federal government. However, there are other functions where we need to exhibit creativity. Next, we need to focus more on planning in disasters, such as what we see with the incident command system. And of course, we need to develop new skills in emergency management. And what are those new skills? I would argue that the new skills include being able to pursue situational awareness, being able to assess the clues or cues in the environment, making sense of the unfolding disaster to understand the extent and scope of the issues, reflecting on existing plans and prior experience that we've had. We must be open to entertaining hunches about how we might respond. We'll have to identify the goals that are new as disasters unfold. We'll have to figure out what needs to be done and then learn on the job in the crisis itself. Other skills include being able to seek the assistance of other collaborators, being able to communicate effectively with others, being able to present and critique and negotiate different points of view and different options to resolve problems, determining how to improvise and how to implement new priorities in real time, of course, and then coordinating the activities with other agencies, and then adapting and adjusting and following up as needed. I think if we do these things, if we're able to develop these skills, we will be more successful in emergency management. To wrap things up, let me just provide one last encore. This is my attempt to perform Eddie Van Halen's most famous solo. It's called Eruption. I'm obviously a lot slower than he is, but hopefully you'll like this nonetheless. This is a couple of minutes, and then I'll have some final remarks. Well, thank you so much for enduring all of that. I do hope this video was entertaining. I hope you learned something new. I hope that some of the principles that Eddie Van Halen taught us about music can be applied in emergency management. I think if we do that, we'll be more successful as we plan and prepare, as we improvise, as we implement spontaneous planning type of activities in disasters. So thanks again and have a great day.